The winter light filtering through the windows of 10 Downing Street on that fateful morning did little to soften the tension rippling beneath London's surface. Though the Blitz had eased and Britain was no longer standing alone, the war's direction remained uncertain enough that every hour carried the weight of history. Deep inside the cabinet war rooms, Winston Churchill moved like a man driven by destiny yet hemmed in by doubt, pacing beneath low ceilings and flickering bulbs that seemed to vibrate with the nation's heartbeat. He had survived political storms and military catastrophes, but now, as British forces prepared for operations in North Africa, the Prime Minister faced a challenge not from Hitler, but from the very generals entrusted with Britain's survival. Maps stretched across the tables like open wounds, Cyrenaica, Gazala, Tobruk, each marked with pins that represented not just strategic points but thousands of lives. For months, Churchill had grown increasingly impatient with the caution that had come to define British high command. He believed the war demanded audacity, yet his generals remained chained to memories of the First World War. The mud of Flanders, the slaughter of the Somme, the stubborn belief that only slow, methodical offensives ensured survival. This, to Churchill, was not strategy, it was paralysis. And now, with Rommel's Afrika Korps prowling across the deserts like a mechanized predator, indecision could be fatal. The crisis erupted when General Claude Auchinleck, commander of the Middle East forces, sent a cable insisting that Britain could not yet launch the offensive Churchill demanded. The army needed months, he argued. Troops were exhausted, equipment worn, supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Churchill read the cable 3 times, his jaw tightening with each line. Months? Britain did not have months. The Soviets were bleeding at the gates of Moscow. The Americans were still finding their footing after Pearl Harbor. And Rommel, with his uncanny instincts and relentless drive, grew stronger by the day. To Churchill, delay was not prudence, it was surrender disguised as caution. This tension had simmered for weeks, but that morning it surged into open conflict. Churchill summoned his senior military advisors, and the underground war rooms crackled with the electricity of confrontation. The generals carried themselves with the certainty of men who had risen through decades of service, yet beneath their confidence lay a growing frustration. Politicians, they believed, meddled in matters they did not understand. Churchill, for his part, saw generals trapped by the ghosts of past wars, clinging to doctrines that could doom the empire. Between them stretched not just disagreement, but a philosophical gulf carved by the scars of history. As the meeting commenced, the air hung thick with unspoken accusations. Churchill studied the men before him, stalwart, methodical, seasoned, and felt the tremor of a truth he rarely admitted: the war could not be won by strength alone. It required imagination, risk, even recklessness. Wars were not saved by waiting. They were won by seizing momentum, by turning weakness into opportunity. His generals insisted that the army was not ready. He insisted that readiness was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The pressure of command weighed heavily on Churchill's shoulders, yet he refused to yield. He remembered all too well how hesitation had allowed Hitler to rearm, to march into the Rhineland, to seize Austria and dismantle Czechoslovakia. Doubt had fed the dictator's rise. Hesitation had paved the path to war. Now, with the world ablaze, Churchill vowed that Britain would never again retreat into timidity masquerading as caution. He would not stand idle while another opportunity slipped away. But this confrontation was different from political clashes. The generals were not opponents, but men upon whom Churchill's fate, and the fate of millions, depended. He needed their skill, their cooperation, their belief. Yet belief was exactly what seemed to be slipping from their grasp. In the war rooms that morning, Churchill felt not simply opposition, but something far more dangerous. A quiet erosion of confidence, a sense that his relentless demands were unrealistic, even irrational. The thought chilled him more than any Luftwaffe raid ever had. Still, Churchill understood that history rarely favored the cautious. Moments of decision, true decision, came wrapped in uncertainty, with no promises save the hope that boldness might outpace disaster. And so, facing his own generals beneath the humming lights of the war rooms, he prepared to wage not a battle of armies, but a battle of wills, a struggle to reclaim momentum, reshape strategy, and remind the British command that wars were not won by waiting for perfect conditions. They were won by those daring enough to seize imperfect ones. The tension in the war rooms thickened as the senior commanders began presenting their arguments, each one reinforcing the same bleak picture. Inadequate tanks, insufficient air cover, exhausted infantry, precarious supply lines running across seas prowled by U-boats. Papers rustled, pencils scratched, and voices, usually calm and measured, carried an undertone of warning. For Churchill, Each objection felt like another brick laid in a wall of paralysis that threatened to encircle British strategy. The Prime Minister listened, stone-faced, but inside him a storm was gathering. He respected these men. He needed them, but he also sensed that their fears were beginning to outweigh their judgment. General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, spoke with the authority of a man who had seen hosts of men cut down in the Great War. He had no patience for reckless ventures, and his skepticism of Churchill's instincts sometimes bordered on open rebellion. Brooke's voice echoed through the chamber as he outlined the logistical nightmare of advancing prematurely across the desert, emphasizing the risk of another disaster like the fall of Tobruk. The other commanders nodded in agreement, creating a united front that seemed to box Churchill in. It was one of the few times in the war when the Prime Minister felt surrounded not by enemies, but by allies who no longer understood the battlefield he saw unfolding in his mind. To the generals, the desert was a map of constraints: distances, fuel consumption, heat, terrain. To Churchill, it was a canvas of opportunity, one where Germany was stretched thin, overconfident, and vulnerable. But as row after row of objections piled up, he felt the heavy weight of a realization. These generals were not merely disagreeing with a strategy. They were questioning his judgment itself. The very idea that the Prime Minister might push them into a disaster terrified them. They feared losing men, losing ground, losing face. Yet Churchill feared something greater: losing the initiative, losing faith in victory, losing the war to the slow grind of caution. The meeting reached its breaking point when Auchinleck's deputy sent a follow-up memorandum arguing that any premature offensive would lead to grave consequences. Churchill, already irritated by the tone of military bureaucracy, felt his patience snap. The phrase, grave consequences, rang in his mind like an accusation, directed not at the enemy but at him. He slammed the file shut, and for a moment the room fell silent, as if the war itself paused beneath the earth to listen. He understood caution. He respected prudence. But he could not abide defeatism disguised as professionalism. Under the dim lights, Churchill's gaze swept across the faces of the commanders: Brooke, Portal, Pound, each of them brilliant, seasoned, indispensable, yet shackled to the ghosts of a different kind of war. He realized then that this was not just a clash of strategies. It was a clash of eras. The First World War had taught these men that caution saved lives. But the Second was teaching Churchill that hesitation could destroy nations. Blitzkrieg had upended everything the generals thought they knew about warfare. The enemy no longer waited for perfect conditions. Why should Britain? Yet even as he felt anger rising, Churchill also sensed the fragility beneath the generals' arguments. They were frightened, not of Rommel, but of another catastrophe that would break the army's spirit. They remembered Gallipoli, the Somme, Passchendaele. They remembered the weight of decisions that condemned thousands. Behind their resistance lay fear too deep to admit. And in that moment, a part of Churchill pitied them, even as he prepared to challenge them head-on. Leadership, he knew, demanded the courage to override fear, not just his own but everyone else's. But pity had no place in the room that morning. Britain stood on a precipice. If the generals prevailed, the desert war would stagnate and the Axis would tighten its grip across the Mediterranean. If Churchill prevailed, Britain would seize the initiative when the enemy least expected it. The stakes were not tactical, they were existential. Yet still the generals lectured him on logistics, presenting spreadsheets and assessments that seemed to drain the fighting spirit from the very walls. The clash escalated when Brooke, with all the pent-up frustration of months of disagreement, declared that Churchill's plan bordered on impossible. The word struck the Prime Minister like a physical blow. Impossible? The same word used to describe holding London against the Luftwaffe. The same word spoken before the evacuation of Dunkirk. The same word uttered before Britain stood alone and refused to fall. Churchill had built his wartime leadership on defying the impossible. Now his own high command was invoking that word against him. For the first time that morning, Churchill leaned forward, his eyes burning with a clarity that startled the room. He no longer saw generals or advisors. He saw men trapped by caution at the very moment the war demanded daring. The confrontation had reached its decisive moment, not on a battlefield but here, among maps and pencils and fears. And Churchill understood that if he could not win this argument, if he could not reawaken the aggressive spirit of Britain's command, then no amount of tanks or troops would matter. The war would be lost long before a shot was fired. The moment the generals finished outlining their objections, Churchill rose slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were gathering the weight of history around him. His hands rested on the table, knuckles whitening against the worn wood, and for a long moment he said nothing. The silence deepened until it felt like a physical pressure, pushing against every man in the room. When Churchill finally spoke, his voice was low but razor-sharp, the voice of a man who had endured ridicule, exile, political defeat, and international humiliation, all to stand at this moment with the fate of an empire resting on his shoulders. He reminded them, not with bombast but with icy clarity, that wars were not won by calculating every possible risk, but by bending events to one's will. He invoked the early months of the conflict, when Britain had stood alone under skies aflame while military experts had insisted defeat was inevitable. Had they waited then? Had they preserved resources and postponed action until conditions were perfect? No, the nation had survived because it had refused to accept doom as strategy. The room shifted uncomfortably. Churchill had touched the nerve he aimed for, the shame the generals still felt for underestimating the enemy in 1940. He wielded that memory like a blade. He then spoke of the desert itself, how Rommel had thrived not because of superior numbers or equipment, but because he acted. Rommel moved when caution dictated staying still. He attacked before his supplies were fully secured. He gambled when logic advised retreat. And each time he had stolen from Britain what the generals believed they were protecting: strategic initiative. Now, Churchill argued, was Britain's moment to do the same. To seize opportunity in chaos. To strike when the enemy expected caution. Standing before them, he looked less like a politician and more like a battlefield commander whose instinct told him that fortune was favoring the bold. The generals bristled, but Churchill pressed harder. He accused them, with words chosen not to humiliate but to awaken, of allowing fear of failure to overshadow the necessity of progress. War, he reminded them, was not an engineering problem. It was a human struggle, shaped by spirit, momentum, timing, and the willingness to take risks. Men did not rally behind hesitation. Armies did not march into victory on the strength of caution. Nations did not survive by waiting for clarity. They survived by forcing clarity upon the battlefield. Churchill's voice rose, not in anger, but with the fierce conviction of a man who believed history was speaking through him. Around the table, faces hardened. Alan Brooke clenched his jaw. Portal folded his arms. Pound lowered his eyes. They were not accustomed to being challenged so directly, especially by a civilian. But Churchill was no ordinary civilian. He understood war not as a series of staff memoranda, but as a psychological contest of wills. He knew the enemy revered momentum as much as firepower. And he believed, with every fiber of his being, that Britain's commanders were losing sight of the single truth that defined every conflict since antiquity. Wars are won by those who dare more. Churchill's words then shifted tone, growing quieter, more intense. He spoke of the men in the desert, the infantry sweltering in the heat, the tank crews choking on dust, the pilots whose shadows skimmed the dunes at dawn. These men, he insisted, were ready to fight. They wanted to fight. They waited only for orders. But every delay drained their morale and fed the myth of Rommel's invincibility. Churchill understood something the generals did not fully grasp. Morale was as powerful as armor. When armies believed they could win, they often did. And when generals believed they could not, they condemned their men to defeat before a shot was fired. The Prime Minister then delivered the blow that changed the course of the meeting, and of the war. He declared that Britain could no longer allow strategy to be dictated by the ghosts of 1914. The world had changed. The enemy had changed. War itself had changed. The desert was not Flanders. The Afrika Korps was not the Kaiser's infantry. And Rommel was not a foe that could be outweighted. If they tried to fight this war with the caution of the last, they would lose it. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a warning. In that instant, Churchill reclaimed the room. The generals, though still resentful, felt the shift. Churchill had not merely argued for an offensive. He had reframed the entire purpose of the war. It was not a struggle of attrition, but a struggle of will. And in this battle inside the war rooms, Churchill had proved his will was stronger. For the first time in weeks, the Prime Minister sensed the tide turning, not on the sands of Africa, but here, among men who needed reminding that leadership required courage, not comfort. And he intended to ensure that courage prevailed. The confrontation in the war rooms had shaken the foundations of Britain's military leadership, but Churchill knew that rhetoric alone could not reshape the war. He needed to expose the flaw in the generals' thinking with the precision of a surgeon. As the meeting resumed later that afternoon, he arrived armed not with bluster, but with documents, reports, intercepted signals, and a breadth of intelligence that many of his commanders had overlooked. His staff had worked through the lunch hour gathering these materials, and now he laid them across the table with the calm confidence of a man preparing to turn the tide of an argument through sheer weight of evidence. Churchill began by detailing the current state of Axis forces in North Africa, not in vague terms but with chilling specificity. He revealed intercepted Enigma decrypts that indicated Rommel was facing fuel shortages more severe than previously believed. Supply convoys from Italy had been ravaged by British submarines and aircraft. Ammunition stocks were dwindling. Several German divisions were under strength. Rommel's tanks, though formidable, were suffering from mechanical failures in the brutal desert conditions. This was the moment, Churchill argued, not in spite of Britain's hardships but because of them. The enemy was weak, vulnerable, stretched thin across miles of hostile landscape. Waiting even a month might allow Axis reinforcements to arrive and erase Britain's advantage. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. They had not been aware of some of these details and Churchill knew it. Intelligence was not a luxury he kept to himself, it was a weapon he now deployed with devastating precision. He reminded them that Rommel's brilliance had always depended on timing, striking before the British expected, turning defensive weakness into offensive strength. If Rommel understood the value of momentum, how could Britain's commanders fail to grasp it? The irony was painful. The very boldness that made Rommel feared was the boldness the British generals were resisting. When Brooke attempted to counter by citing the army's depleted condition, Churchill unfurled casualty and reinforcement reports, showing that British forces, though battered, were still numerically stronger than the Axis units immediately available. He conceded that the troops were tired, the tanks worn, the desert unforgiving. But he argued that waiting for ideal conditions in North Africa was like waiting for calm seas during a hurricane. War did not grant perfect moments. It offered fleeting windows of opportunity, and only those willing to act seized them. To reinforce his point, Churchill summoned field reports from officers stationed on the desert front, many of whom described their men's desire to regain the initiative. Morale, he revealed, was slipping not because soldiers were overused, but because they felt trapped in defensive postures. Troops who believed their leaders were afraid to attack quickly lost faith. An army that lost faith could crumble faster than one that lacked equipment. This truth, Churchill emphasized, was as old as warfare itself. The energy of an army flowed from confidence. And confidence flowed from action. The commanders shifted again, some visibly irritated, others contemplative. Churchill pressed the advantage. He argued that Britain's global strategy depended on what happened in North Africa. A victory would open the Mediterranean, strengthen ties with the Americans, prevent Axis access to Middle Eastern oil, and relieve pressure on the Soviets. A defeat, or worse, stagnation, would embolden Hitler, prolong the war and leave Britain fighting on unfavorable terms. The desert was not a sideshow, it was the hinge on which the entire strategic picture turned. Churchill then invoked a comparison that pierced right through the heart of the generals' resistance. He reminded them that in 1940 France, the mighty French army with more tanks and more troops, had fallen not because they lacked resources, but because their commanders had been frozen by caution. They waited for clarity, for perfect coordination, for the moment when every piece aligned. That moment never came. Germany did not defeat France through superior strength. It defeated France through superior will. Britain, he warned, was courting the same fate by allowing fear of another disaster like Tobruk to paralyze decision-making. The weight of that comparison settled over the room like smoke. The generals, veterans of the Great War who had revered France as the bastion of continental military strength, felt the sting of Churchill's implication. If France had fallen because of timidity, what did that say about Britain's current posture? The accusation was not spoken aloud, yet everyone heard it. Churchill had struck directly at the psychological core of their resistance. He ended the session not with triumph, but with a challenge. Britain, he said, stood at a crossroads. One path led to perpetual delay, strategic stagnation, and the gradual erosion of hope. The other led to action, imperfect, risky, but vital. If Britain did not seize this moment, it might not receive another. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of defiance. It was the silence of men reckoning with the realization that their caution, while understandable, might be leading the empire toward disaster. Churchill had done what he set out to do. He had shaken the foundations of military orthodoxy and forced his generals to confront a truth they had long avoided. In the days that followed Churchill's confrontation with his generals, the struggle shifted from heated exchanges in the war rooms to a quieter, more insidious battle waged across memos, late-night strategy conferences, and whispered conversations in the corridors of Whitehall. It was a conflict without gunfire but filled with tension every bit as fierce as the clashes unfolding in the desert. The generals, though shaken by Churchill's forceful arguments, had not surrendered their perspectives. Instead, a subtle resistance formed, rooted not in disloyalty but in the deeply ingrained habits of men forged in the long agony of the First World War. They feared another disaster, another futile sacrifice. And Churchill knew that fear was the most dangerous enemy of all. Alan Brooke, the towering figure of the British High Command, became the axis around which this resistance revolved. Though he respected Churchill's leadership and admired his audacity, Brooke believed that the Prime Minister's strategic instincts, however brilliant, sometimes veered into recklessness. His diary entries from the period reveal a man torn between admiration and exasperation, a commander convinced that he alone was shielding the army from potential ruin. Brooke worried that Churchill's intensity clouded his judgment, that the Prime Minister viewed war through the prism of destiny rather than logistics. In Brooke's mind, it fell upon him to protect Britain from its own leader's impetuousness. Churchill sensed this tension long before it became explicit. He knew Brooke's mind, understood his fears and even respected his caution. But he also recognized that Brooke represented the intellectual fortress of the old British military. Rational, methodical, cautious, to a fault. To Churchill, caution had its place but not when opportunity hung in the balance. Not when Rommel waited just beyond the horizon. Not when every week of delay risked giving the enemy room to recover. The war, Churchill believed, was testing the very capacity of the British command to adapt. And he feared his generals were failing that test. Inside 10 Downing Street, Churchill confided subtly in his closest civilian advisers, not in a spirit of conspiracy, but out of the frustration of a man facing resistance from the very institutions meant to support him. His private secretary, John Colville, observed the strain. Churchill would pace his study at odd hours, muttering about missed chances, the weight of history, and the dangerous temptation of passivity. He drank more whiskey than usual, smoked more cigars, brooded more deeply, his mind circling the same question. How could he spur the High Command into the bold, decisive action the war now demanded? Meanwhile, the desert itself seemed to mirror the turmoil in London. Reports from North Africa described a lull, a deadly calm, while both sides waited for their respective strategies to unfold. The British Eighth Army held tenuously along the lines of Gazala, digging trenches and repairing vehicles under the unrelenting desert sun. Morale wavered. Officers sensed the hesitation from London, and soldiers whispered that High Command was too cautious to challenge Rommel. Churchill feared this creeping fatalism more than any enemy tank. He believed that, left unchecked, it could hollow the army from within. The tension between Churchill and the generals intensified when Auchinleck sent yet another cable warning of insufficient readiness. To Churchill, this was the moment the war within the High Command became a crisis. The document read like a plea for postponement disguised as prudence. It left the Prime Minister pacing in fury. How many times had he heard these arguments? How often had hesitation been masqueraded as strategy? He saw in Auchinleck's words not a sound assessment, but the steady erosion of British fighting spirit. His frustration crystallized into a single, inescapable conclusion. Leadership must be reclaimed, even if it meant challenging the most senior officers in the Empire. At the next War Cabinet meeting, Churchill's impatience became impossible to ignore. He spoke sharply, almost coldly, dissecting the objections raised by military command. His arguments were no longer aimed at persuading, they were aimed at asserting authority. He reminded his ministers that Britain had survived 1940 not because it had possessed superior strength, but because it had possessed superior resolve. Now, that same resolve was being smothered by a mentality that had belonged to the trenches of 1917, not the mechanized deserts of 1942. Tensions reached a breaking point when Churchill privately asked whether he should replace Auchinleck altogether. It was not a question asked lightly. Churchill respected the general's skill and bravery, but he no longer trusted his strategic vision. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the cabinet. Changing commanders during a critical moment in the Desert War was a gamble with enormous consequences. But for Churchill, the greater gamble was allowing hesitation to dictate strategy. He knew that unless decisive action was taken, at every level from leadership to logistics, the British Army risked ceding North Africa forever. In this fraught atmosphere, Churchill began preparing for a showdown, not just with the Axis but with his own military establishment. The crisis within the High Command had reached its zenith. Churchill understood that if he failed to push through his strategic vision now, Britain would become a prisoner of caution, and Rommel would continue to shape the war's destiny. The Prime Minister had fought too long, suffered too much, and staked too many lives on the promise of eventual victory to allow paralysis to triumph. The moment was approaching when Churchill would challenge his generals, not with anger but with the full force of his strategic conviction, and emerge victorious. The night before Churchill delivered his final challenge to the military establishment was one of the most defining of his wartime leadership. The clock inside Downing Street ticked with an almost accusatory rhythm as he paced the floor, cigar smoke curling through the dimly lit room like the ghost of every decision he had made since becoming Prime Minister. Outside, London lay in blackout, the city's great monuments hidden behind darkness, but Churchill barely noticed. He was replaying the arguments with his generals, examining every objection they had raised, weighing every fear they had confessed, both openly and implicitly. Somewhere in that tangle of doubts and defiance, he searched for the final clarity he needed before confronting them once more. His desk was littered with maps marked in red grease pencil, intelligence summaries, letters from frontline officers, and personal notes scribbled in the margins of reports. One sheet in particular caught his eye, a report from an armored regiment describing the soldiers' frustration at being held in defensive positions for so long. They wanted to fight. They wanted to regain pride. They wanted to erase the memory of previous defeats. Churchill read the words slowly twice as though absorbing the pulse of the army through ink and paper. In those lines he recognized the heart of the issue. The generals saw exhaustion, shortages, and risks. The soldiers saw only the void left by inaction. As he stood at the window, staring at the faint orange glow of smoldering ruins from a recent air raid, Churchill felt the weight of leadership more acutely than ever. The responsibility was suffocating. On one side stood the generals, men of impeccable experience, men who would carry the blame if an operation went wrong. On the other stood the reality of the war, unforgiving, unpredictable, merciless. He had to choose between two forms of peril, moving too soon or moving too late. And yet, as the minutes passed, he realized that the general's caution, though grounded in logic, was risking something even greater than failure. It was risking momentum, morale, and the initiative vital to victory. No records detail the full extent of Churchill's private thoughts that night, but those closest to him observed a man wrestling with more than strategy. He questioned himself in ways he would never reveal publicly. Was he pushing too hard? Was his instinct clouded by the desperation of a man who had defied catastrophe too many times to surrender now? Was he guilty of the same blindness he accused the generals of harboring? He poured another measure of whiskey, slow, contemplative, and let the doubt linger long enough to feel its sting. Leadership, he knew, demanded humility as much as confidence. Yet as the night deepened, a sense of calm began to settle over him. The conflicting arguments, the fears, the objections, all coalesced into a single immutable truth: Britain could not afford to be reactive any longer. Every successful moment in the war thus far, from Dunkirk's evacuation to the Battle of Britain, had been born from decisive action taken in the face of uncertainty. Now, he realized, was another of those moments. If he allowed his commanders to delay again, he would be betraying everything he had stood for since that night in May 1940 when he had taken office and vowed to lead Britain without flinching. He returned to the table and began writing. Not speeches, not proclamations, but notes, short, sharp instructions that would guide the confrontation to come. He wanted to speak plainly, directly, without rhetoric or flourish. He needed the generals to feel the urgency as he felt it, to understand that the war was not waiting for them to perfect their plans. He underlined key words in thick strokes: act, momentum, initiative, opportunity. These were not mere concepts. They were the lifelines upon which Britain's future now depended. As dawn approached, Churchill stepped outside into the cold morning air, the sky just beginning to pale. He inhaled deeply, the chill clearing the fog of a sleepless night. He felt older than his years, worn by responsibility, yet he also felt a fierce determination burning beneath the fatigue. The path forward was set, not by stubbornness but by the harsh logic of war. The upcoming meeting would decide whether Britain moved boldly or remained trapped in caution. Churchill knew he could not force his generals to be daring, but he could compel them to confront the reality that to do nothing was itself a fatal gamble. And so, as the first grey light spread across London's war-torn rooftops, Churchill straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and prepared to fight one of the most crucial battles of his political career. Not against Rommel, not against the Luftwaffe, but against the entrenched caution of the very men who shaped Britain's armies. The night had given him clarity. The day would demand courage. The day Churchill finally resolved to confront the crisis in the High Command began to darken long before the sun sank over London. By late evening, the streets around Whitehall lay cloaked in blackout shadows, broken only by the glow of sentries' lamps and the distant hum of vehicles navigating wartime curfews. Inside 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's study flickered with the amber light of a desk lamp, its glow falling across stacks of memoranda, cables and strategic maps that read like the biography of a world at war. Churchill sat alone, the weight of command pressing against him like an unwelcome companion he could never dismiss. The decisions he faced now were as perilous as any he had made, in some ways more so, because they concerned not the enemy, but the guardians of Britain's own military soul. He poured a modest whiskey, though the bottle had been opened twice already that afternoon. The drink steadied him, but what he needed was not courage, it was clarity. The long campaign in North Africa had drained his patience and frayed his temper, but it had taught him something more valuable than anger. Hesitation at the top trickled downward like poison. Soldiers sensed indecision the way animals sensed weather. If generals wavered, entire divisions faltered. If commanders doubted, armies broke. The thought haunted him as he reviewed Auchinleck's latest message insisting that an offensive be delayed until autumn. Autumn, when Rommel might be reinforced, when the Axis might regain strength, when the narrow corridor of opportunity might have slammed shut. Churchill lit another cigar, the smoke swirling upward like a gray phantom above the paperwork. His mind traveled back to the early days of the war, Norway, the fall of France, the collapse of Belgium, every calamity worsened by delays, misjudgments, and the unwillingness of leaders to act decisively when the moment demanded it. History had shown him the cost of caution. And now, as his generals circled him with the same defensive thinking, he felt the ghosts of those past failures urging him not to yield. The Prime Minister had built his wartime reputation on defying fear. But now the fear he faced came not from Hitler, but from his own high command. Later that evening, as he walked into the underground cabinet war rooms, he felt the strange mix of comfort and dread that always accompanied him into that subterranean labyrinth. The narrow corridors, the low ceilings, the humming fans, they were the architecture of Britain's endurance. His generals were waiting in the map room, their faces drawn with fatigue, their uniforms stiff from long hours of tension. Brooke stood near the large desert map, arms crossed tightly, his eyes fixed on the Gazala line. The air felt thick with expectation. They all knew why Churchill had summoned them at this late hour. The moment had arrived when something had to give, either Churchill's strategy or the general's resistance. The mood was solemn as Churchill took his position at the head of the table. He began not with anger, but with a chilling calm that commanded the attention of everyone present. He spoke of the global stakes, the situation in the Pacific, the brutal siege of Stalingrad, the precarious lines in Burma, the pressure in the Mediterranean. Britain could not afford stagnation. Every front was connected. Every delay in North Africa affected operations from the Caucasus to the Indian Ocean. This was not a local debate, it was a global one. Britain's entire war effort depended on momentum, not defensive entrenchment. Then Churchill delivered the argument that cut deepest. He reminded the generals of a truth they themselves taught young officers. Initiative was the heart of military victory. Yet here they were, surrendering initiative to Rommel. Again. Every postponed offensive gave the enemy time to reorganize, repair damaged armor, and reposition his mobile units. Rommel thrived on British hesitation. "We cannot," Churchill said, voice tightening, "continue preparing to fight the last war while the enemy fights this one." The generals said nothing, but the tension in Brooke's clenched jaw revealed the blow had landed. As the discussion dragged into late night, Churchill listened to renewed objections. Lack of transport, insufficient armored replacements, concerns about coordinating air support. But the tone had shifted. The generals were no longer united. Some had begun to waver. The Prime Minister saw it, the cracks forming, the first signal that the iron facade of resistance was weakening. He seized the moment, pressing them with relentless logic. Britain had a temporary advantage. Rommel was at the end of his supply lines. His fuel reserves were dangerously low. Italian convoys were being destroyed at sea. Even the Luftwaffe units supporting him were stretched thin by commitments elsewhere. If Britain did not strike now, it might never again have such an opportunity. By the time the clocks neared midnight, a heavy silence settled over the room. Every man present sensed that a pivot in history had arrived. Finally, Churchill delivered the sentence that ended the stalemate. "If our commanders in the field cannot grasp the strategic necessity of immediate action, then we must appoint commanders who can." The words dropped like stones into water, stirring shock, anger, dread, and for some relief. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Brooke shifted uneasily. The others looked down. Churchill had drawn the line none of them expected him to voice so plainly. And in that charged silence, the war changed direction, not in the sands of Libya, but in an underground room lit by electric lamps. Churchill had made his decision, and now the wheels of command would turn. The challenge against his generals had entered its decisive phase, and the Prime Minister knew that before dawn, the course of the Desert War, and Britain's military destiny, would never be the same again. The moment Churchill realized the conflict with his generals had reached its critical point, he withdrew into the solitude of his study, a dimly lit room where the shadows of maps and the silhouettes of half-burned cigars lingered like silent advisors. Outside, London lay draped in blackout darkness, interrupted only by the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns. The war was everywhere, in the streets, in the skies, in the endless stream of casualty reports that arrived at Churchill's desk. But now the war had seeped into the very heart of British leadership. Churchill knew that the decisions made in this room on this night would determine the fate of the Desert Campaign, and, potentially, the fate of the entire Allied struggle. He settled into his chair, whiskey in hand, and read once more the stack of reports from North Africa. The ink seemed to burn into the page. Britain was at a crossroads, one so delicately balanced that a single hesitation could send everything spiraling into catastrophe. Churchill felt the full weight of command pressing upon him, yet beneath the expectation and the exhaustion, a pulse of clarity emerged. The generals were wrong, not in their facts but in their fear. They saw danger, he saw opportunity. They counted obstacles, he counted possibilities. They waited for the perfect moment, he sought to create it. As the clock ticked past midnight, Churchill summoned a select group of civilian advisors, trusted figures who understood his mind, his instincts, his brilliance, and his stubbornness. They arrived quietly, slipping through the darkened corridors like conspirators in a struggle not against the enemy, but against timidity. Churchill spoke with calm intensity, outlining his position with the precision of a man who had wrestled with every argument. He explained that Britain had reached a turning point. The desert was not merely a distant front, it was a strategic fulcrum. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled the Mediterranean shaped the entire course of the war. The advisors listened, some nodding, others shifting uneasily as Churchill dissected the arguments of the high command. He explained that generals often misunderstood the political dimensions of strategy. They focused on battalions, he focused on nations. They saw immediate losses, he saw long-term consequences. They feared the cost of risk, he feared the cost of inaction. It was not arrogance that drove him, it was the understanding that wars were not measured solely in divisions but in perceptions, alliances, and the fragile balance of morale. A bold strike in Africa would signal to the world that Britain still possessed the will to fight aggressively, even after years of devastation. At one point, Churchill rose from his chair and approached the large map spread across the far wall. His finger traced the coastlines, the supply routes, the railway lines leading toward Tobruk and beyond. His advisors watched as he seemed to commune with the battlefield itself, seeing patterns invisible to others. In that moment, Churchill was not merely the Prime Minister, he was a strategist, a historian, a prophet of momentum. He knew that if Britain waited, Rommel would rebuild. If Britain hesitated, Axis strength would consolidate. But if Britain acted now, boldly, decisively, the balance of the Desert War could be reversed. The room grew heavy with the realization that Churchill had made up his mind. There would be no retreat into caution. No deference to generals whose fear was shaping their counsel. No delay disguised as prudence. Churchill set down his whiskey, straightened his posture, and with the quiet certainty of a man stepping into history, declared that Britain must move forward with an offensive, and not a timid probing action, but a full, committed, aggressive strike aimed at breaking Rommel's hold on North Africa. The words were not shouted, they were carved into the air with unshakable conviction. As the advisors departed and the room emptied, Churchill remained standing before the map, staring at the deserts of Libya as if he could already see the future unfolding there. The silence pressed in on him, yet he felt no doubt. He knew the generals would resist. He knew the War Office would groan under the weight of another argument. He knew that the entire machinery of British command might push back against his decision. But he also knew this. Leadership demanded not merely listening to experts, but discerning when their expertise blinded them to necessity. In the early hours of the morning, Churchill finally extinguished the lamp in his study and stepped into the corridor, walking with the slow, deliberate stride of a man carrying the fate of an empire. What happened next would shake the military establishment, electrify the war cabinet, and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of the Desert War. Churchill had made his choice. Now he would make the generals accept it. The desert had always been a realm of extremes. Heat that seared the lungs by day, cold that gnawed the bones by night, sandstorms that swallowed entire battalions and whirlwinds of dust. But by early 1942, the Sahara had become something more. A vast, shifting arena where the fate of continents hinged on decisions made thousands of miles away in London. As Churchill fought to awaken resolve among his generals, the desert itself was reshaping the conflict. Storms destroyed convoys, mechanical failures crippled armored divisions, and the Axis supply chain, already stretched thin, buckled under pressure. In this unforgiving landscape, fortune began subtly tipping toward the Allies, offering the very opportunity Churchill believed his commanders were blind to. Deep in Cyrenaica, British reconnaissance units observed with growing interest how the Afrika Korps struggled to maintain momentum. Fuel shortages forced German columns to halt for days at a time, their tanks sitting idle beneath the scorching sun. Italian supply caravans, long preyed upon by British submarines in the Mediterranean, became increasingly erratic. The enemy's once fluid maneuvers slowed into hesitant advances, echoing Rommel's rare frustration in his field diaries. The desert was punishing everyone, but the Axis, dependent on fragile logistics, suffered most. These conditions, Churchill argued in London, were not obstacles but invitations for bold action. From the front lines came accounts of how British soldiers, though exhausted, sensed a shift in the wind. Patrols reported scenes of abandoned enemy vehicles, half buried in sand, left behind after engines overheated or fuel evaporated under the ceaseless sun. Morale flickered tentatively upward as officers whispered that Rommel's aura of invincibility was beginning to crack. Yet the inaction from high command made this resurgence fragile. The troops waited, ready to strike, but saw only hesitation in the strategic directives flowing from Cairo. To Churchill, these whispers from the desert were confirmation that the moment to act had arrived. To delay was to betray an opportunity carved not by generals, but by the desert itself. At RAF bases across the Middle East, pilots observed similar signs of Axis vulnerability. Luftwaffe bombers arrived less frequently and often carried lighter payloads, an unmistakable indicator of fuel rationing. Ground crews noticed that German aircraft appeared patched together, their maintenance stretched to desperate limits. British intelligence watched these developments with cautious optimism. Rommel was a master of improvisation, but even he could not conjure fuel from sand. The longer the Afrika Korps remained stalled, the more their formidable reputation risked eroding. Churchill saw these signs as cracks in the enemy armor large enough for Britain to drive an entire offensive through. Meanwhile, local Arab and Berber communities, long navigating the desert with ancestral instincts, reported sightings of Axis convoys moving erratically, sometimes backtracking, sometimes splitting into smaller units to avoid air attack. These reports, though anecdotal, painted a portrait of a force losing its cohesiveness. Churchill devoured every scrap of intelligence like a man searching for proof that history was on his side. In private, he confided that the desert seemed to be conspiring with Britain, offering a fleeting window in which the line between success and failure hung in delicate balance. But windows, he knew, closed quickly in war. Yet despite these signs, the British military establishment remained gripped by caution. Brooke and Auchinleck argued that such vulnerabilities were temporary, that Rommel could recover rapidly, and that launching a premature offensive based on fluctuating intelligence was too risky. They warned that Churchill's optimism could misinterpret transient weakness as strategic collapse. But Churchill saw deeper. Wars were not won by waiting for an enemy to remain weak long enough to make planners comfortable. They were won by striking the enemy precisely during those fleeting moments when fortune hesitated between sides. The desert winds were shifting, and Churchill refused to let fear anchor Britain's arm. Complicating matters further, the Americans, newly engaged in the global conflict, watched British actions in North Africa with keen interest. They sought evidence that Britain was not merely content to endure, but determined to attack. Churchill knew that demonstrating bold leadership in the desert would strengthen the burgeoning Anglo-American alliance. If Britain appeared hesitant, American strategists might shift focus toward the Pacific or deprioritize North Africa as a secondary theater. The future of Allied cooperation hung in the balance, and Churchill understood that decisive action in the desert could cement America's trust at this critical early stage. As these international pressures mounted, Churchill became increasingly convinced that the moment for action could not be postponed. The sands were shifting beneath Rommel's boots, and each day Britain waited risked forfeiting the advantage carved not by generals, but by fate. The Prime Minister saw clearly what his commanders refused to admit. For all their caution, it was hesitation, not audacity, that truly endangered the empire. North Africa was calling Britain to reclaim the initiative, and the call was growing louder. Churchill felt the echo in his bones. The time was coming when he would challenge his generals, not simply with words, but with a decision that would reshape the war. The moment Churchill realized the conflict with his generals had reached its critical point, he withdrew into the solitude of his study, a dimly lit room where the shadows of maps and the silhouettes of half-burned cigars lingered like silent advisors. Outside, London lay draped in blackout darkness, interrupted only by the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns. The war was everywhere, in the streets, in the skies, in the endless stream of casualty reports that arrived at Churchill's desk. But now the war had seeped into the very heart of British leadership. Churchill knew that the decisions made in this room on this night would determine the fate of the Desert Campaign, and, potentially, the fate of the entire Allied struggle. He settled into his chair, whiskey in hand, and read once more the stack of reports from North Africa. The ink seemed to burn into the page. Britain was at a crossroads, one so delicately balanced that a single hesitation could send everything spiraling into catastrophe. Churchill felt the full weight of command pressing upon him, yet beneath the expectation and the exhaustion, a pulse of clarity emerged. The generals were wrong, not in their facts but in their fear. They saw danger, he saw opportunity. They counted obstacles, he counted possibilities. They waited for the perfect moment, he sought to create it. As the clock ticked past midnight, Churchill summoned a select group of civilian advisors, trusted figures who understood his mind, his instincts, his brilliance, and his stubbornness. They arrived quietly, slipping through the darkened corridors like conspirators in a struggle not against the enemy, but against timidity. Churchill spoke with calm intensity, outlining his position with the precision of a man who had wrestled with every argument. He explained that Britain had reached a turning point. The desert was not merely a distant front, it was a strategic fulcrum. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled the Mediterranean shaped the entire course of the war. The advisors listened, some nodding, others shifting uneasily as Churchill dissected the arguments of the high command. He explained that generals often misunderstood the political dimensions of strategy. They focused on battalions, he focused on nations. They saw immediate losses, he saw long-term consequences. They feared the cost of risk, he feared the cost of inaction. It was not arrogance that drove him, it was the understanding that wars were not measured solely in divisions but in perceptions, alliances, and the fragile balance of morale. A bold strike in Africa would signal to the world that Britain still possessed the will to fight aggressively, even after years of devastation. At one point, Churchill rose from his chair and approached the large map spread across the far wall. His finger traced the coastlines, the supply routes, the railway lines leading toward Tobruk and beyond. His advisors watched as he seemed to commune with the battlefield itself, seeing patterns invisible to others. In that moment, Churchill was not merely the prime minister, he was a strategist, a historian, a prophet of momentum. He knew that if Britain waited, Rommel would rebuild. If Britain hesitated, Axis strength would consolidate. But if Britain acted now, boldly, decisively, the balance of the Desert War could be reversed. The room grew heavy with the realization that Churchill had made up his mind. There would be no retreat into caution. No deference to generals whose fear was shaping their counsel. No delay disguised as prudence. Churchill set down his whiskey, straightened his posture, and with the quiet certainty of a man stepping into history, declared that Britain must move forward with an offensive, and not a timid probing action, but a full, committed, aggressive strike aimed at breaking Rommel's hold on North Africa. The words were not shouted, they were carved into the air with unshakable conviction. As the advisors departed and the room emptied, Churchill remained standing before the map, staring at the deserts of Libya as if he could already see the future unfolding there. The silence pressed in on him, yet he felt no doubt. He knew the generals would resist. He knew the War Office would groan under the weight of another argument. He knew that the entire machinery of British command might push back against his decision. But he also knew this. Leadership demanded not merely listening to experts, but discerning when their expertise blinded them to necessity. In the early hours of the morning, Churchill finally extinguished the lamp in his study and stepped into the corridor, walking with the slow, deliberate stride of a man carrying the fate of an empire. What happened next would shake the military establishment, electrify the war cabinet, and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of the Desert War. Churchill had made his choice. Now he would make the generals accept it. Far beneath the streets of London, in the dim, stale air of the underground war rooms, Churchill prepared for the moment he knew could redefine not just the direction of the Desert Campaign, but the very balance of authority within Britain's wartime leadership. He was no stranger to conflict, but the battle he was about to wage was unlike those fought at sea or in the skies. This was a confrontation of philosophy, conviction, and nerve, and unlike the Axis, Britain's own generals could not be bombed into submission. They had to be challenged with the force of clarity, vision, and courage. Churchill's conviction hardened. The time had come to end the standoff. The desert demanded decision. In preparation, he immersed himself in the smallest details of the North African campaign. He read every field report, scrutinized each analysis of troop strength, memorized fuel statistics, studied patterns of Axis supply, and even consulted meteorological projections for the coming months. To the frustration of his staff, he slept little and ate almost nothing, consuming instead vast quantities of whiskey, tea, and exhaustion. Yet his mind sharpened. He emerged from this self-forged crucible with a complete grasp of the situation, far more detailed than most members of his military command. Churchill was preparing not merely to argue, but to demonstrate unmistakably that caution had blinded the generals to the true shape of opportunity. Simultaneously, the desert itself seemed to pulse like a living force awaiting judgment. British intelligence reported that Rommel was consolidating around Gazala, fortifying positions while awaiting reinforcements from Italy. The situation was precarious for both sides. Supply lines were strained to their limits, the terrain unforgiving, and both armies exhausted. But the German edge, so dangerous in the past, was fraying. Rommel's tank crews battled mechanical failures, his infantry suffered from heat and thirst, and his headquarters sent increasingly desperate messages requesting fuel, spare parts, and ammunition. The Desert War had become a race not of speed but of nerve, and Churchill's instincts told him that nerve was precisely what Britain must summon. Yet even as Churchill prepared his case, the generals were digging in. Within the upper ranks of Britain's military command, a quiet consensus was forming. The Eighth Army was not ready, not strong enough, not sufficiently supplied to launch an offensive. They believed that Churchill's impatience stemmed from political concerns rather than strategic necessity. Some privately feared that he was pushing for action merely to show Stalin and Roosevelt that Britain was still capable of bold operations. This suspicion, though never spoken aloud in his presence, permeated the thinking of the War Office. They saw his resolve as dangerous ambition. Churchill saw their hesitation as fatal timidity. Aware of these whispers, Churchill sought counsel from those whose judgment transcended bureaucracy. He met privately with Air Chief Marshal Tedder, whose presence in the desert gave him a clear sense of the shifting momentum. Tedder spoke candidly. Rommel was vulnerable, perhaps for the first time. Axis air power had been diminished. British intercepts revealed fuel starvation. Tedder believed that the moment for action was fast approaching, but he worried that waiting even a month would allow Axis forces to resupply through Tripoli. This confirmation strengthened Churchill's belief that he was right, and deepened his resolve to break the general's resistance. But it was a different report that truly ignited Churchill's fury. A letter arrived from an officer in the Eighth Army, one whose name Churchill insisted on keeping confidential, describing the psychological toll of perpetual defense. The men, he wrote, were growing restless. They were losing faith not in themselves but in their leaders. They feared that British generals lacked the will to take the fight to the enemy. They whispered rumors of Rommel's invincibility. They believed their commanders were too afraid of another Tobruk to act decisively. For Churchill, no assessment struck harder. The desert, he knew, was not merely a battlefield of tanks and infantry, it was a battlefield of morale. And morale had begun to tilt dangerously in favor of the Axis. Churchill carried that letter into his study and read it again and again beneath the lamplight. The words haunted him. Soldiers who had fought through hell were losing faith because their commanders refused to seize opportunity. He could not allow it. He would not allow it. The desert demanded clarity. Britain demanded resolve. The war demanded leadership unfettered by fear. The next morning he summoned his war cabinet and announced that he intended to challenge the generals at the highest possible level, with no ambiguity, no hesitation, and no retreat. The time for gentle persuasion had ended. The time for decisive confrontation had arrived. As he prepared for the meeting that would become infamous within military circles, Churchill felt the weight of history settle across his shoulders, not as a burden but as a summons. He walked the corridor toward the war rooms at a slow, deliberate pace, each step echoing with the memory of battles fought and futures yet unwritten. For years he had battled enemies abroad and critics at home. But now, in this narrow corridor lit by dim bulbs, He faced a more intimate adversary, the entrenched caution of Britain's own generals. Churchill inhaled deeply, adjusted his coat, and stepped into the room where he would challenge them, and win.